like to welcome you to the City of Santa Barbara Planning Commission meeting for September 9th, 2021. And at this time, I'll ask my colleagues and our Planning Commission Secretary, Ms. Fennessy, to please come online for a voice roll call.
Thank you. I will now start the roll call. Chair Schwartz.
Here.
Vice Chair Escobedo.
Here.
Commissioner Bonderson.
Here.
Commissioner Higgins.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge.
Here.
Commissioner Reed.
Here.
And Commissioner Biscombe.
Here.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fennessy. And now we'll ask Ms. DeBusk to join us for our preliminary matters. And the first is any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have none.
Do we have any announcements or appeals?
Yes, I did want to announce that the development agreement for the project at 701 North Milpas will be heard by the City Council this upcoming Tuesday, September the 14th. So if you'd like to follow that, you can tune in. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us know about that, Ms. DeBusk. And at this time, do we have any comments from members of the public like to speak to us on items not on our agenda today, Ms. DeBusk?
Thank you. For anyone in the audience on the GoToWebinar platform, if you'd like to make a comment on items not on today's agenda, please click the raise lower hand icon in the control panel, and I will notify you when it's your turn to speak. Everyone has 2 minutes, and the red arrow pointed down indicates that your hand is raised. At this time, I'm not seeing any members of the public raising their hands. Ms. Fennessy, did we receive any written general correspondence?
Thank you, Ms. DeBusk. We did not receive any general written correspondence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. DeBusk and Ms. Fennessy. Colleagues, you can now go ahead and turn your cameras off, and we're going to turn to staff, and I believe it's Ms. DeBusk who may be providing us the staff report, the item that we have before us today, where our one item is a new item. It's a voluntary concept review, 533 East Mitchell-Terrena Street. Ms. DeBusk, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. As you said, we are here today for concept review of a proposed mixed-use condominium development. And if we can get the staff PowerPoint presentation on screen. Thank you. Next slide. So the purpose of today's concept review is to provide feedback from decision makers to the applicant and staff. Next slide. The project proposes to add 7 residential condominiums to a site that is currently developed with 2 residential condominiums and 10,100 square feet of medical office space. This is the proposed Salsa Street elevation drawing of the existing development with the proposed addition. Next slide. The project site is located at the northwest corner of Mitchell-Terrena and Salsa Streets. And the project site is 21,258 square feet. Next slide. Here we have an aerial view of the project site. Next slide. And this is the area on the site that is proposed for redevelopment. Next slide. Just to orient you to the neighborhood, here we have some photos of existing development along Salsa Street with the existing and proposed development shown below. Next slide. And this is the view from Mitchell-Terrena site with the project site on the right-hand side, which is the corner parcel. Next slide. Before I go into the details of the project, I did want to provide you with a brief overview of the process steps for this project. The project was initially submitted in May 2019 for a pre-application review team review, and it has been to the Architectural Board of Review twice for a concept review. The formal application was submitted in August 2020 and was deemed incomplete by staff. The applicant requested a concept review with the Planning Commission to get feedback on several items, including the sidewalk width and requested modifications. Next slide. After receiving conceptual feedback from the Planning Commission today, the applicant will resubmit the project for staff review. The project will return to the ABR for concept review. And once the application has been deemed complete and environmental review has been completed, the project will return to the Planning Commission for a decision. If approved, the project would then continue on to the ABR for project design approval and final approval. And then the applicant would record the final map, obtain a building permit, and ultimately construct the project. Next slide. So as I mentioned, the project is a mixed-use development that includes a total of 9 residential condominiums comprised of 2 existing and 2 new, and also commercial condominiums totaling 10,100 square feet. The total square footage of the project would be approximately 25,000 square feet, and vehicular access to the site would be from Salsa Puertas Street. Next slide. The residential units average 1,145 square feet each, which is consistent with the city's average unit size density incentive program. Here's some elevations of the proposed development. Next slide. And additional elevation drawings. Next slide. So as currently designed, the project would require the following land use approvals: a front setback modification, an interior setback modification, open yard modification, parking modification, and a tentative subdivision map for the condominiums. Next slide. I'll walk you through each of these requests using the site plan for reference. So here we have the site plan for the project. The existing development is on the left-hand side of the screen, along with Mitchell-Torena Street. And the proposed development would be on the right, where the existing upper parking lot is located. Next slide. The first request is for a front setback modification. The required setback for the first and second floors of the building is 10 feet, which is shown by the red dashed line. The project proposes a setback of 7.5 feet, and the area of the building that encroaches into the setback is shown and circled in red. Next slide. As you can see, the existing structure also encroaches into this setback. So another part of the front setback modification is for the third floor to encroach into that setback. The required front setback for the third floor of the project is 20 feet, and the project proposes a setback of 8.5 feet. The area of the building that encroaches is shown and circled in red. As you may have heard at the site visit and in the staff report, Salsa Puertas Street was previously a driveway, and so existing development on this parcel was developed with an interior setback from that property line. When Salsa Puertas Street was dedicated as part of the St. Francis Hospital redevelopment with the Bella Riviera condominiums, it became a public street, and therefore the property line became a front setback. So that's why the existing development does not meet the current setback requirements, and it's considered non-conforming and can remain. Next slide. The second modification request is for an interior setback on the third floor. The required interior setback for the third floor is 10 feet, and the project proposes 8.5 feet. The area that encroaches is shown in red and also circled in red. Next slide. The third request is for an open yard modification. 15% of the lot area is required as common open yard, and the minimum dimensions must be 10 feet. Therefore, the project requires 3,188 square feet of open yard. The only area on the site that technically qualifies under this definition is the existing 483 square foot courtyard. I do want to note that the staff report erroneously stated that the site had no qualifying open yard, so I do apologize for that error. Next slide. Private open yard has been provided for each of the units in the form of decks. However, 2 of them do not meet the city's minimum size requirements. The purple areas on this slide show the private decks at each level of the development. The code does allow for an alternative open yard design, which does not require private open yards, but does require a 20 foot by 20 foot common open yard area. And that's in addition to the 15% requirement. For this project, that 20 by 20 common area is provided on the 2nd floor of the new building and is shown in orange on this slide. Next slide. Alternative open yard also allows the decision maker to reduce or waive that minimum 10-foot dimension requirement. And so if the minimum dimensions were waived on this project site, then the 6-foot interior setbacks could count towards their open yard, and that would bring the open yard on this project to 2,264 square feet, which is approximately 10% of the lot area. Next slide. The 4th request is for a parking modification. This project is proposing 46 parking spaces. Some would be at grade, and some would be in a new parking stacker in the parking garage. The city's parking ordinance requires 60 parking spaces for this development, comprised of 40 commercial and 20 residential spaces. However, the existing commercial development is non-conforming and can continue to provide the 36 spaces that it currently has. As for the residential development, the city municipal code currently has 2 different parking requirements. A rental project developed under the AUD program requires 1 parking space per unit, plus accessible parking and any additional loading spaces that are required due to use of a parking stacker. However, the city's condominium ordinance still requires 2 parking spaces per unit plus guest parking. The applicant was not made aware of this different condominium parking requirement until recently, and the project does comply with the rental parking requirement, but not that higher condominium parking requirement. Next slide. The 5th request is for a subdivision map to essentially divide the airspace so that the units can be sold separately. Next slide. The applicant also wanted to discuss the width of the sidewalk dedication along Salsapuedes Street. The city's pedestrian master plan specifies a 5-foot wide sidewalk and 4-foot wide parkway for streets the width of Salsapuedes Street. Staff has considered the existing site improvements and topographical constraints and allowed a reduction in the overall pedestrian improvement widths by eliminating the 4-foot wide parkway. The applicant has requested a further reduction to a 4.5-foot wide sidewalk with no parkway, based on the constraint of the existing development. An area approximately 5 feet wide would be located behind the sidewalk and would serve as a landscape buffer between the sidewalk and the building. However, you can see that on this slide, there are some existing mechanical equipment that encroaches, so that landscape buffer would not be continuous along this sidewalk. Staff recognizes the constraint of the existing building and on-site improvements, but still recommends that a 5-foot sidewalk be provided where feasible. And this could narrow down to a 4.5-foot wide sidewalk at pinch points where the 5 feet cannot be achieved. The Public Works Director ultimately has authority to determine the appropriate sidewalk width. And any comments on this aspect of the project from the Planning Commission will be provided to the Public Works Director for consideration. Next slide. This is a concept review, so no decisions will be made today. However, I wanted to briefly run through the findings that would ultimately need to be made for the requested discretionary actions. For the open yard and setback modifications, the Planning Commission must find that the modification is needed to either secure an appropriate improvement on the lot or prevent unreasonable hardship due to the physical characteristics of the site or development, or result in development that is generally consistent with existing patterns of development in the neighborhood, or to construct a housing development containing affordable residential units. Next slide. For the parking modification, it must be found that the parking demand will be met on site, or that there are unusual or unique circumstances of a particular case that warrant a modification. Next slide. And finally, for the subdivision map and condominiums, the Planning Commission must find that the project complies with the Subdivision Map Act and Municipal Code, is consistent with the general plan and zoning ordinance, that the use is consistent with the vision for this neighborhood, the site is physically suitable for the type and density of development, that the project will not cause environmental damage and will not cause serious public health problems, that it's consistent with the principles of sound community planning, and that there would be no adverse impact to the neighborhood's aesthetics, parks, streets, traffic, parking, and other community facilities and resources. Next slide. So in conclusion, staff recommends that the Planning Commission provide conceptual feedback to the applicant on the project as a whole, specifically commenting on the setback modification requests, open yard modification request, parking, and public improvements. Thank you. And we now have a presentation from the applicant.
Thank you, Ms. DeBusk. And if Mr. Hamilton, who's handling our technical support today, could put up the timer for 20 minutes once we have the applicant representative come online. Welcome, Ms. Turner.
Hi, good afternoon.
And why don't you go ahead and introduce all of the representatives from your team.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, and Commissioners. We appreciate you talking with us today. My name is Jane Gray. I am the planner from DUDEC on this project. The team we have includes myself, Melissa Sinarli Turner, project architect, along with Mark Kirkhart, project architect. Next slide, please.
And let's pause for a moment. Mr. Hamilton, could you please put up the 20-minute clock before Ms. Gray continues, so we can all track with the time? Let's see if he can make the clock work. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and watch the time myself, but I'd rather not have to rely on that.
I apologize. It appears to be showing on my screen, but no one else's. Let me see what's going on with that.
Well, you know what, that's oh, there we go. I was just about to say, we see. Let's go ahead and reset it at 20 minutes, please, since I intervened. There we go. Okay, back to you, Ms. Gray.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the presentation today. Our team will provide you an understanding of the property, the project background, the proposed project that you all will be discussing, an overview of the requested modifications, waivers, and our response to the Transportation Division, as well as the findings, and then we will open it up for questions and comments. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Turner for the next section.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Melissa Turner from DesignArc. I'm a senior project manager here. We're here on behalf of the Santa Barbara Holdings Company for the Empire Group to discuss their project at 533 East Mitchell-Torina. Next slide, please. As you can see from our aerial view, we are on the corner of Mitchell-Torina and Sasapuedes Street. We are surrounded by various uses, including rental housing, market rate housing, condominium, workforce housing with the Bella Riviera, medical office, of course, which, as you recall, this zone was commercial office zone previously, and currently has been rezoned as a residential multi-housing. Next slide. Our building was developed actually by DesignWorks, a predecessor to DesignArc, by our firm back in the 80s. It's an existing mixed-use building, 3 stories with 9 condos, as Allison pointed out. The lower level parking lot is primarily served by patients that visit the medical office component, and the upper lot is used by the tenants and owners, with the exception of the 4 tuck under parking. If staff person can highlight their cursor on the upper portion of your screen to the left, right behind the building, those 4 parking spaces are our tuck under residential condominium parking. The existing tenants include medical office uses such as pediatricians, an autism center, chiropractor, and acupuncturist, and then 2 residential condos that are on the upper floors. Next slide, please. There's a picture of our site on the corner. As you can see, we don't have a sidewalk on the western portion of North Sasapuedes Street, and you kind of get a preview a little bit of the sidewalk on the eastern portion of Sasapuedes Street, up against the Bella Riviera property. Currently, the only pedestrian access to our site is through Mitchell-Torina Street. Next slide, please. Just to give a little bit of history and background and some site context, I think this will be really helpful. Allison touched on this briefly. Next slide, please. The St. Francis Bella Riviera property to the east, shown here in this historical photo aerial, had a private driveway to access their parking lot. Our site then had an interior lot line against their property. When it was developed back in 2006 and approved, I think at the time, that access easement over their driveway was then converted to a public street, although not one that meets the current standards. The public right-of-way of North Sasapuedes Street below Mitchell-Torina currently is at 60 feet, and I believe the one adjacent to our project is substandard, closer to 34 feet. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, when the project was developed, our parcel inherently was imposed a hardship, having to now have 2 street frontages, one on Mitchell-Torina and one on Sasapuedes. That didn't become a problem then, but now it makes it more challenging, forcing us to have an increased setback of 10 feet instead of 6 feet on the eastern property line, and then 20 feet above the 2nd story, which is why we're here today to get some of your input. Next slide, please. A little bit more detail on what I just described. The area shown in green is a 30-foot by 100-foot parcel that was kind of left over and abandoned during the transaction of with Cottage Hospital. I'm sorry, with St. Francis Hospital at the time. No further improvements have made to that, and we do not control or own that parcel. Therefore, we cannot take advantage of some of that open space. Bella Riviera was able to seek additional relief when they redesigned the street. They didn't really widen it, which was unfortunate, and therefore putting a little bit more burden on our project today. During their development, they were able to seek 4 different setback modifications, including along Sasapuedes Street, Mitchell-Torina Street, Arriaga, and I believe some on California Street. Hopefully today you'll understand why we're hoping to get some of that relief as well. Next slide, please. So our proposed project, this is an urban infill, obviously, on the Riviera. Next slide, please. The site slopes significantly at 13%, and given the existing constraints on this site and the existing development standards on site, what we're hoping to achieve is still bring the project as a whole into more conformity with the current residential zone. We're proposing 7 residential unit AUD condos market rate with the 2 existing in the existing building. The average unit size proposed is 1145 square feet as shown on the screen, but the new units are actually smaller than that. That's because the 2 existing units are slightly larger and drive up our average a tiny bit. Our proposed density is at 18.4 dwelling units per acre, which is lower than what the maximum is allowed at 27 dwelling units per acre for 13 units. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. I won't, oh, one back, please. Thank you. The project design went through an ABR concept review ahead of our PRT, and then we had a PRT review to get feedback from staff. We then had an ABR concept review with addressing some of those comments that we heard, and finally a DART submittal. Allison already covered a lot of that. I don't want to dive into all of the details of the changes we've done, but a lot of work has been completed to date, including getting an archaeological report for the site, a civil grading and drainage plan, a civil stormwater management analysis, a landscape design, of course, at a conceptual level, and some dry utility coordination and will serve letter by the Edison. Some of the broad brush overview of the revisions, we know that we had a positive feedback from ABR that overall agreed that the mass size, bulk scale, and architectural style were acceptable and fit into the context of the neighborhood. Next slide, please. A lot of the site-related changes here are visible in our proposed site plan. Some of them were very minute and more detail-oriented. I won't bore you with them, but our location of transformer, the addition of a new trash room in addition to the one that we're proposing in the existing building that you can see there. Thank you. Had to redesign the elevator and elevator lobby and accessibility to our building by providing a new accessible path from the existing building to the new building, and accessibility to the new trash enclosures. Thank you. And additional parking revisions on grade to meet current ADA standards. So additional ADA stalls and ADA van stalls were provided, and additional bicycle parking. As Allison pointed out, when we first started with this project at ABR, one of the first comments we received was, have you considered putting a mid-block crosswalk to get some pedestrian access to the project? Ultimately, Public Works was not in favor of that, and suggested that we study the option of putting a sidewalk, which we have. It's curr'ently shown here at 4'6" plus a 6-inch curb of 5 foot. Later on in the presentation, you'll hear Jane and Mark talk a little bit more about that, some of the existing constraints that we have with the site wall around the HVAC units up against the building, and also the need to preserve as much of the landscape for privacy in front of the existing building. The pedestrian master plan allows us some flexibility with the 4'6" sidewalk, and ABR commented that they would prefer we have a contiguous sidewalk rather than having some ins and outs as much as possible. Other parking changes were done, and then of course we talked about a little bit about the landscaping. Our proposed landscape plan talks about improving the existing landscape around the surrounding building, maintaining as many of the existing palms and reusing them on site, and then relieving some of the trees that have been overly pruned that no longer seem to be viable in their current location. Next slide. With that, I'll turn it over to Mark Kirkhart, who'll talk a little bit more about the programming, the architecture and design changes that we've done. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the commission. Mark Kirkhart, Principal Design Architects. I'm going to move this along pretty quickly because it's already been gone through, and Jane has some other more detailed information to go over. So the first level of our building on the upper parking lot contains all of the parking, as well as bicycle storage and storage for the individual homeowners. Next slide, please. So the level above the parking All these units are townhouse units. So they're two-story townhouse units on the ends of the building and on both ends of the building. And in the middle, on the northerly portion, are two three-story townhouses that are actually upside down units that have the living space on the upper floor. On the southerly side, you have two-bedroom townhouses on the east and west, and the one that's wedged in between is a one-bedroom unit. Next slide, please. So this shows how the second floor of those condominiums work. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the only portion that's 3 stories is this portion in the middle. Those are the 2 living rooms for those units that are on the top floor. And they also have very large, expansive decks on the south. Next slide, please. We've already seen these, but I want to point out in the right-hand illustration that the gable end that's right to the right of the driveway, right where you were pointing a second ago, that's the area, that little small, the gable end piece is the area that we're asking for the modification for the setback. It does not include any square footage of the floor area. It is only a thickened wall with shelves on the inside, so it doesn't add any additional square footage. Next slide, please. These are just representative showing that we do meet all the height limit. Next slide, please. Section views, once again, just showing the overall how we're building above stacked car parking on the ground level. Next slide, please. So just to discuss in detail the setback modifications, you can see here on the upper left-hand side, that's the architectural projection that we were asked, that I mentioned in the previous slide. Does not add any new square footage to the unit. It helps with the massing on the building, and the ABR really weighed in on that and they liked it. So the third floor, you can see that shaded area, that's the portion that is resulting only because we are now required to meet a front yard setback as opposed to an interior yard setback. And the diagram to the right shows the same situation on the west end where we're asking for a modification, just to have that little architectural projection. Once again, it does not add any square footage. Next slide, please. And I think this shows us the most clearly the portion of the building that is actually we're asking for the modification. On the left shows the building with the piece plugged in, and this shows you the amount of area that we're asking for the modification. A couple more overall views. Next slide, please. We were asked by the ABR to model our building and show it in the context of the neighborhood. So you can see our building right behind the pink building is kind of wedged in between the medical office buildings. You can see that with the medical office buildings along Mitchell-Terrena, our building is well within the mass and scale of the neighborhood, especially even the large Bella Riviera red tile roof that's behind us. Next slide, please. Same, just showing a little bit different vantage point. In the last 2 slides, please. Next slide. So there's several views now that you can see what the building block dropped into the site looked like from Mitchell-Terrena Street. Next slide, please. It's showing various vantage points. This would be from the street to the south of this. The last slide. And this is from up above, looking down Sausapuedes. You can barely see the building there on the far left. Thank you for your time. I'm going to turn over now to Jane to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. As I'm sure you know, next slide, please. Thank you. This is modifications and waivers and responses to the staff comments from transportation. And as I'm sure you all know, parcels within the city of Santa Barbara are not created equally. Embedded within the city's planning and zoning regulations is the opportunity for decision makers like yourself to exercise discretion on a case-by-case basis in order to best serve the property's needs and the community's needs. Again, we're here today seeking comments from you with respect to the requested modifications, setback encroachments, waiver requests, and transportation comments. The intent of the next series of slides is really just to provide you with an overview of the modifications being sought to address the site constraints. We hope your commission will take into consideration the changes in zoning that the site has experienced throughout the many years that it has persisted, This has gone back and forth from residential to commercial zoning. And of course, this is legal non-conforming, but we are responding to an oscillating series of requirements. So again, the modification requests we are seeking here today are the setback modifications in the front to allow encroachments of parking space, mechanical equipment, portions of residential condominium building in the front setback along Sol Cipuedes, as well as the interior setback modifications to allow encroachment of portions of the residential condominium buildings as to the interior setback along the northwestern property. Next slide, please. Under the AUD ordinance, the project is overparked. However, as Ms. DeBusk alluded to, the condominium ordinance is now the prevailing ordinance. Therefore, the project is underparked. It's our understanding that the Planning Commission and the City Council will be discussing revisions to the condominium ordinance later this year and potentially early next year in order to harmonize those parking requirements. At some point, if those are harmonized, this potential modification request would be removed. Next slide, please. Mr. Kirkhart and Ms. Sonarli Turner went over the setback modifications. Again, this is just the overview related to the east property line setback, the third floor and second floor, as well as the third floor property line setback. Again, these are architectural articulations and do not increase floor area. Next slide, please. As it relates to the waiver of open yard minimum requirements, up until about a few weeks ago, both DART and PRT, as well as ABR comments and discussions with staff and other decision makers have been related to the need for a waiver, as the project has been utilizing the alternative open yard design. When reviewed by ABR, there was agreement that although the project did not meet the minimum dimensions of 10 by 10 for some open yards in certain locations, due to the existing constraints, as we've discussed extensively on the site, that there was adequate open yard within the sizable private balconies and decks. These were taken into consideration and that a total at that time in excess of the 15% requirement. The existing development does afford units with more than the required decks, 1 if not 2, and 4 units have decks that exceed the ordinance requirement for the common yard and open yard methodology. Next slide, please. Again, here is just the same example, discussions related to the less than 10 by 10 minimum requirement, the waiver being supported by ABR as we've discussed, and the private yard outdoor living space calculations that ABR also approved. Next slide, please. So in response to the Transportation Division sidewalk improvement requests, the applicant is proposing to use the table 8 of the low pedestrian master plan sidewalk zone table as opposed to the high pedestrian. And the applicant is proposing this sidewalk along North Sol Cipuedes, consistent with that table 8 as I just alluded to. Again, there have been changes in the modifications of that street. And we would like to cite that there is compatibility, neighborhood compatibility with the Bella Riviera property. So there is precedent for decreasing the 5-foot sidewalk that does not impair circulation. And right across the street, there is an example of that reduction of parkway and sidewalk. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll go to the findings. I'm going to try to wrap this up in 40 seconds. I'm a New Yorker, maybe I can make it. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, overview of modification and waiver request. Next slide, please. So in our estimation, the project fulfills the purpose of the ordinance by expanding multi-unit housing with smaller residential units near transit and within walking and biking distances to the commercial service areas and activity centers. In terms of the front yard modification, there is wide precedent in the neighborhood and the city of Santa Barbara for this modification. Next slide, please. Minor front yard and interior setback modifications. I might need to leave this until questions. My time is up. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Vice Chair, and Planning Commissioners.
Thank you. And I'm sure that the wide-ranging questions from commissioners will allow the applicant team to come back and really flesh out all of this. So thank you, Ms. Gray.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
With that, I wanted to come back. You go ahead and go off camera, Ms. Gray. And I wanted to ask Mr. Busk, as my colleagues come back online, to see if we have any members of the public who would like to speak to us on this item today.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. For members of the public that would like to make a comment on this project, if you're joined by the GoToWebinar platform, please click the raise lower hand icon in the control panel. Each speaker will have 2 minutes to speak. And just a note that the red arrow pointed down means that your hand is raised. At this time, we have 3 public speakers. I will start with Matthew Grise. Matthew, you have...
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm a fellow architect and I happen to live next door in the Bella Riviera development, also a New Yorker. I'm in favor of this project. I think DesignArc has done a commendable job threading the needle on a very tricky set of both zoning and design constraints. They're being forced to add a sidewalk, which is great for the neighborhood. The absence of any sidewalk on the west side of South Pueydes has definitely been a concern when my family goes for walks. So this will clearly be a welcome improvement to the neighborhood. But as a result, they're then having to deal with an increased setback and all that goes along with it. Combine all this with the 13% slope on South Pueydes, and this project is facing really a uniquely challenging problem with respect to site accessibility. And they figured all that out. In addition, they've also had to accommodate all the other land use requirements. There's parking, utilities, trash, not to mention the open yard requirements. So this is not an easy project. And I think they've done a great job getting something beautiful to take shape here. And so I'm commenting today because I believe the Planning Commission should provide reasonable flexibility in a case like this. I also think the community in general should welcome this sort of effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grise.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Maria Zate, followed by John Campanella. Maria, you have 2 minutes if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to comment. I just wanted to point out that the street South of Paredes on that block is very narrow. It's not a regular street, and I live at Bella Riviera. There are 2 driveways that go out to that street. That's the only access for probably more than 100 cars at Bella Riviera. And it can be tricky to navigate exiting and entering the properties and navigating other cars as they go up and down that street. I'm a little concerned that the building is going from lot line to lot line, and that there would be challenges to sites when people are leaving, exiting that project to turn onto South of Paredes Street. That's why I don't believe that there should be modifications to any of the setbacks. And I know the project developers have kind of said, oh, these are not very, these are not very big modifications that we're asking for. But I think that just the fact that they can't meet the yard requirement and the setback means that they should probably go back to the drawing board and perhaps scale down the bulk and the mass of the project so that they won't have to have the modifications. I'm very grateful that they are adding a sidewalk. It just really enhances the pedestrian experience on that street. And I do believe that they ought to have more landscaping and pet areas. I know that there's so-called open yards for each of the individual condos, but most people will probably have pets and they aren't going to be able to have their pets use those concrete open yard areas without lawns. So that means that a lot of the burden for those kinds of things falls to the Bella Riviera project, which has numerous landscaping and lawn areas and a park. So I think they should be a good neighbor and add more landscaping to their project and reconsider not having to ask for so many modifications. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zate.
Our next speaker is John Campanella, followed by Brian Lezak. John, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Just 2 items I'd like to touch on. Number one is the surprise to the applicant, which I understand about condominiums requiring more than 1 parking space under the AUD program. The AUD program is quite clear that only market rate ownership projects in the USS overlay require parking according to the base density and not the provisions of the AUD. I don't know if other applicants were aware of this as well, or potential applicants. We really haven't had a lot of condo submissions, and I don't believe any have been submitted in the Upper State Street area. But I think the intent is to get more condos built. But if someone needs an exception every time they come in, or a misunderstanding, I would think maybe Planning Commission, with the help of staff, would try to clarify that the AUD program really prevails in these cases if that's what you're submitting your project under. Nobody knows what may happen to parking come next February when all of the other ordinance amendments might be going through under the FAR. So I'd like maybe that to be clear by the Planning Commission and staff that the AUD is really the rule relative to condo parking. Secondly, the 20-foot setback might eliminate a relatively modest 2-bedroom unit. And the unit sizes and number of units are within what's allowed. And I would think an exception could be made in order to make sure that this modest unit on the end is fully able to be utilized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Campanella.
And our final speaker is Brian Lezak. Brian, if you unmute yourself, we have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for allowing me the time, and thank you for the presentation. I thought it was extremely thorough and really thoughtful, and I think the project makes unbelievably good use of the site itself. And is, often in infill projects, you need to make minor modifications in order for them to work and fit within the guidelines of the plan. And this one, I think, works perfectly from a mass, bulk, and scale perspective. And you should definitely provide reasonable flexibility relative to the minor changes that they're requesting to get this project developed. So hopefully you'll take that into consideration, and thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Lezak.
Thank you. I don't see any other members of the public with their hand raised. If anyone wants to make a comment, please raise your hand. And I will also explain, if you'd like to become an interested party on this project, you can submit an email request to pcsecretary@santabarbaraca.gov, or you can also call us or submit a written request using the information on the screen. This information is also available on the Planning Commission agenda. Thank you. Seeing no other raised hands, Ms. Fennessy, did we receive any written correspondence on this item?
Thank you, Mr. Busk. We received 5 written correspondence for this item that was distributed to the board prior to this meeting.
All right, thank you to everyone, members of the public. And so now it's back to the commission. Who would like to go with questions? Staff, the applicant, Ms. Bonderson, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to start by asking a general question in order to really understand the scope of our role here today as planning commissioners. I sent a series of questions to Ms. Ostringer with regard to one of our public comment letters directed to us by Mr. Lynch. I believe that's William Brennan Lynch. He brought to our attention that the information, based on the information that Mr. Lynch provided, he seemed to provide to us that the owner is not legally allowed to develop this project without all of the property owners who share rights on this existing property. to be involved, to be in agreement, and therefore I had asked Ms. Ostringer if any of those legal documents were provided with this project, either to staff or to the city attorney's office, and she had shared back that she had not received them. I was interested in having her share a little bit more about that procedure. Ultimately, I would like us to all be clear on how to move forward reviewing a project like this, where there may not be legal authority for the owner or the agent to act at this time to move a project like this forward. Could you share with us a little bit more direction, Ms. Ostringer?
Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Bondison, thank you for the question. Yes, as you and I emailed back and forth, this is just a concept review, so the board's not, or the commission's not taking any formal action. So at this time, it's okay to move forward. And now that the issue has been raised, if the applicant submits the formal application, it's something that we would look into at that time and work through with the applicant.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I just wanted to be really clear and make sure that public comment had been acknowledged, that we are aware of this issue, and that we'll be moving forward just reviewing this project conceptually. Thank you, Ms. Ostringer. Madam Chair, if you don't mind, I will hold the remainder of my questions until later.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. Commissioner Higgins, did you want to go next with questions?
Sure. I was just going to suggest it seemed like Ms. Gray ran out of time right at the meat and potatoes part of her presentation, or that which is kind of the subject of why we're here. And if she wanted to take more time, I wouldn't object to that, to spend some time on that particular slide.
Well, how about, let's do it this way. How about if you pose a question to her that will bring her back on, and then she can respond to your question?
Sure. If the applicant can come back on in further detail, I'm most interested in this front yard modifications and the basis for those office house appointments.
Right. Thank you. Do we have, can we pull the presentation back up so that we have the item to look at? Is that possible? Great, thank you. And we can go to that section of the PowerPoint presentation. So Commissioner Higgins, are you referring to the front and interior setback modifications? Okay, so yes. Yeah, so essentially, and I don't have both the exhibit and the findings on the same slide, so my apologies for that. But it's our understanding that, in order to meet the finding, we need to fulfill the purpose of the ordinance. So the purpose of the ordinance, as you know, is to expand multi-housing and smaller residential units within the city. And I do think it's significant in light of these modifications that are being requested, not only the site constraint discussions that we're having, but also this is the first project, the first condo project that is moving forward in the city under the AUD ordinance that was passed in 2013. So it's really taken 8 years for a project to get to this point. And I think that really underscores, the larger issues here, and that we do in the city have a number of site constraints and parcels that are smaller. So in terms of the front yard modification, one of them is related to the transformer. And this is not an atypical situation. There are a lot of existing and proposed transformers within the front yard setback. That is seen in adjacent properties, and it's pretty common throughout the city. The applicant did seek the Council of Southern California Edison, as well as a dry utilities consultant. And both of them, as you can see from the slide, agree that this is actually an optimal location and certainly allows more access. Screening is not a problem, and screening can be introduced through landscaping around that area. So that is the first front yard and interior setback modification request. Second,
can I just interrupt you for a second? You said something that maybe I misheard, but it sounded like you said this is the first AUD project. Can you?
This is the first condo AUD project that is moving forward. So this is proposing for sale condominium units So it's not the first AUD, but it's the first condominium project under the AUD ordinance.
Okay, keep going.
Thank you. Next slide, please, so that we have it just for everybody's reference. Thank you. And then again, for the front yard modification requests related to the residential condominium interior and encroachment portions of the residential condominium building, we feel that we can make the findings in that the minor building encroachments on the second and third floor and along the east and western property lines do not at all increase floor area. They are purely there for visual relief and articulation of the building overall. It provides additional volume, supports the architectural elevation and massing, and these are generally viewed favorably by the ABR.
So let me just ask you right there, because you say there's not additional floor area, but you said there's additional volume. So
yeah, so exterior volume, I don't know if we want to pull up, and maybe Melissa or Mark, you can.
you're just saying basically that the request is not adding floor area, so
Correct.
it shouldn't be a big deal.
Exactly. It's not adding to the floor area of any of the units. It's really exterior articulation of the building.
Okay. The public speaker, Mr. Campanella, indicated, and maybe I'm off on the wrong modification, but that somehow one of the units wouldn't be there if it weren't for the modifications. Seem to suggest that the unit size would shrink, or can you clarify by how many square feet, or whether or not any units would be lost without all of these requests combined?
Yes. Melissa, did you want to take that since?
Sure. If you could, staff could pull up the slide number 33 of the PowerPoint. Or actually, sorry, 22 would be better, and then 23. Can we go down to 22, please? Slide number 22.
I apologize. The PowerPoints are all combined into one, so the page numbers are going to be a little bit different. What image are you looking for?
If you scroll through the elevations and sections, the one after that is a setback modification exhibit, and there's two exhibit, one slide after another. The first is showing in floor plan, and the second one is showing it in the model, correct? Can you go back to the one previous first? Thank you. Commissioner Higgins, Chair Schwartz, on the lower left portion is a partial floor plan that shows the third floor eastern property line and setback. There is a 20-foot setback along this side, and a 2-bedroom unit that's highlighted here would be eliminated. It would probably then, if we couldn't get past your support on a modification for this portion of the encroachment, then that unit would have to be redesigned, and it would be a small, either it would be completely gone and the lower level would have to be a studio. Right now, these are all designed as townhome units, 2-bedroom townhomes. So this is the upper floor that indicates the bedroom.
Yeah, so this is the upper level of your townhome, and
Correct.
It's got the bedrooms in it, and so it's really wiping out 70 or 80% of the second level
Correct.
of that particular unit. Okay.
Yes, that is correct. So this is the only location where the encroachment has square footage attributed to it. The other two examples shown on this slide on the top and right side of the page are shelf areas or thicker walls like Mark described that just provide a little bit of volume into the living room, or in the other case, a little bit of shelf space in the small bathrooms.
I guess while I have
In addition to modulating the architectural expression of the building from the exterior, I was just trying to describe the interior programming.
Got it. Just while we're here, I'll take liberty to say with these modifications and for example, the transformer, again, it's optimal, but I think in reading the staff report, it sort of looks like what was being asked and not given was what what happens to the project if you don't get the mods? What else would the transformer go on the property? And that may seem pretty straightforward to you designers and engineers about how inconvenient that would be, or from a design perspective, holistically impractical. But if you could educate us about that, either today, if you want to take the time, or later when you come back, that's what I would be looking for. Those are my questions, Madam Chair.
Ms. Turner, did you want to respond, or Mr. Kirkhart? I think today is the day to really try to flesh all of this out in concept discussion, where we're not pressed to make a decision. We're just providing comments.
Correct. If we could go to the site plan, I could answer that question, Jay. I mean, basically, we'd have to lose a parking space, is what would happen. And we'd, if you could go back, yeah, say that this perfect right here. So you can see where we have the transformer there located now. We would probably have to move it to the south on the opposite side of the drive aisle. And to get it outside of the setback, we'd lose those first 2 spaces on the on that lower level of the driveway, right? Because we'd have to move it inside of the setback. So it'd have to be where the cursor is now showing. And I suppose we could have it just taking out that 1 space in between, have it between the 2 parking spaces. So you're going to lose 1 or 2 parking spaces in order to move it out of the setback.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, for that particular mod, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Higgins, Ms. Schwartz, Chair Schwartz, I just wanted to clarify with staff, but the transformer discussion was already reviewed and I believe was in the purview of ABR, though we welcome your comments, of course. It's, again, not uncommon. Most of our projects will have a transformer equipment. As you can tell, the pad is a little bigger and requires quite a bit of clearances around 3 or 5 feet, anywhere between 3 to 8 feet in order to service it. So it's quite large. And the location, given the site slope and access, this was probably the best location we could put it for maintenance crews, which is what the SCE letter and the dry utilities consultant vouched for.
Sure.
Thank you.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, and I think I almost struggle with whether or not utility pads, et cetera, are something that could be exempt from setbacks, but they're not. But sometimes I daydream about that too. Anyway, I appreciate the background, and I had one more thought, but I'm going to have to come back to it because it's left me. So go ahead, Commissioner Wiscombe.
Thank you, Commissioner Higgins. Continue your daydreaming. We're going to go over to Commissioner Wiscombe now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I remember a couple of my questions at least. Okay, I'm going to jump around here a little bit. I wanted perhaps the applicant team to comment on the ABR, the last meeting they had. It would be comment number 2, applicant shall comply with the 20-foot setback requirement for the 3rd and 4th floor. Any significant modification request for this setback would be problematic and not acceptable. So could someone address that? Because that's very contrary to what we're seeing here, where we've got that setback encroachment and we're being asked to comment on a modification for that. So if we were to respect ABR's comments on that, I just like someone that was at the meeting to address that.
Could we go to a specific page, maybe, Commissioner Wiscombe, for everyone's reference? Are we talking about Exhibit C?
We're talking about page 52 of 52 in our packet under the motion. Continue indefinitely. It's comment number 2.
Yes, exactly. Okay.
So. Yeah, so if we go to that slide 65, which if we could go there, which is the encroachment on the 3rd floor. Yeah, okay. So this slide, the bottom left slide here is what ABR is talking about, is it not? Can someone from the applicant team come on and respond to that? That was at the ABR hearing?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe, Chair Schwartz. Yes, I was at the hearing. The minutes are a little bit confusing, and I'm going through them again now because we also got general comments and support on the mass size bulk scale of the project. It says it's mostly acceptable, but then the following comment that you read says that that portion of the building in the 20-foot setback would be problematic. So there's a bit of a conflict between those two comments. The general sense while I was at the hearing is that the mass size bulk scale and the neighborhood compatibility was there, although they weren't ready to vote because of the Planning Commission review on those items. I don't know if this helps answer your question.
Well, I guess it doesn't, because that is a very specific comment to that particular encroachment in the setback. So I think that
I agree.
Merits further attention. And it's a significant encroachment. It's basically
a little over 8 feet.
Yeah, it's you're asking for an 11-foot 6-inch reduction in the 20-foot setback is how I read it. So you're ending up with 8 feet 6 inches. That's how I read the staff report. So in the 20-foot setback, that's an 11-foot 6-inch reduction, which is pretty significant. So I maybe would ask the applicant team to, further study that and see if that can be reduced something closer to where ABR was in their very specific minutes. Mr. Kirkhart, did you have a comment on that?
Yes, please. Thank you. It's our feeling that the Bella Riviera received setback modifications on all 3 of their street frontages. And it's our opinion that this project being basically strapped with having a two front yard setbacks is very extreme for the size of this parcel. So, we feel the not being able to get that 3rd level modification will, as pretty much as John Campanella had mentioned, will probably result in losing a unit. So in our opinion, we wanted to take the temperature, hear what Planning Commission thought about it. In our opinion, we're not asking for something that is not already enjoyed by other property owners in the neighborhood, including directly across the street where they received the same kinds of modifications. Not to mention the existing medical building above us to the north of us is straight up. That building got built without any additional front yard setback when it was built, when it was a driveway. So it seems to us that it's extreme and that we're being asked to do something that other properties in the neighborhood are able to enjoy, that not having to have that 3rd floor setback. So.
Okay. I appreciate your answer. I think, comparing this project, which is market rate condos, to a workforce housing project, has some, and a very large workforce housing project, it's a little bit like apples and oranges in some cases, but, the community benefit for the Bella Riviera project was immense to provide the workforce housing. So that's not a comment. I'm not making a comment about that. I'm just asking you if you have looked at this and have the other part of my comment then on that is, would the loss of this unit create an opportunity perhaps to add some open yard area where you are significantly lacking again? I don't think that the Bella Riviera complex is lacking an open yard. So that's a comment, or is it something you've looked at? And generally, have you looked at other places in the development that might be redesigned to increase the really quite significant deficit you have in open yard.
Our approach was always that the common open space, the common area deck that we have on the second floor would also accommodate the open space. And even though, you know, if it was in a commercial zone, it would. But my understanding now is that you know, we have on the second floor, we have a large common area deck that takes us well over the 15% when you include all the private decks as well. So there just basically isn't any room on the site, on the dirt, terra firma, to add any additional open space.
Okay. Okay, and then I wanted to ask, and I don't know if this is for staff or for the applicant team, and I will say, just to comment on that, there's significant comments in our staff report that basically say the modification lacks justification necessary to make the findings required. That's repeated a couple times in our staff report. So I just, in terms of the setback modifications. And I wanted to move on to the parking modification. Now, first of all, you are legally non-conforming with 36 commercial spaces when the project would require 40. And now you are going down to 34. Is that correct? That's what my understanding is.
Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Wiscombe, yes, let me bring some clarity to that. The original permitted drawings had a shell of a building for 10,100 square feet of area. But when the building was developed, the true net commercial area does go down. That's something we had to vet in our office to get to the bottom line. So yes, it wouldn't, in lieu of 36, it goes down to 34 spaces.
Okay, so you actually need a modification for that. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. The modification is, yeah, I'll see if I can shed some light, and maybe Allison can come in as well. The modification on the parking is purely.
Speak to that first, because my understanding from the staff report is you're legally non-conforming at 36, but if you're going down instead of up, then you need to get a mod for that. Is that right, Mr. Busk?
Yeah, so that's something that we will need to delve into deeper with the applicant. They have said that in detailing out these drawings and measuring the actual built square footage, that it went down, and therefore the parking requirement would actually go down as well. But that's something that we need to confirm and work with them to make sure that all those numbers work out. If we're using that 10,100 square foot number, then yes, they need the 36 parking spaces to remain. If that number decreases, then there may be a reduced requirement that we will work with them on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Buskin. If you just stay there a minute, because I want to go on to that. I looked at the parking layout and read the staff report. This is on page 11 of 52. The parking design does not meet the parking area design and development standards as required by the zoning ordinance and the city's access and parking design standards. And it looked to me like the parking, it's got this funny back out space and everything. I think, is that what it's referring to? So when you take your car out of the stacker, you have to go into this back out space next to the ADA parking to get it to go in the right direction?
Commissioner Wiscombe, I will let Ms. Momolsky answer that. And I do also want to mention that the plans have changed a little bit since we last reviewed them officially by the city. So there may have been some changes to try and address those comments, but we haven't done the formal plan check to see if they actually addressed the comments.
Okay, so our comments today are based on the fact that the staff report says the parking design does not meet the city standards, right? Is that what we're commenting on today? Since this has not been a formal review yet by staff?
Right. The way that we view that is we will work with them to resolve it. It can't not meet our standards. So that's
Right.
something that will get worked out as the plans continue to move through the review process.
Okay.
What we just don't know is if addressing all those comments ultimately ends up in fewer parking spaces. We just can't give that level of detail at this point.
Okay. Ms. Mamolsky, do you have comments too on this? Hi there.
Thank you, Chair Schwartz
you.
and Commissioner Wiscombe. I would just add to what Allison said, that we'll continue to work with the applicant to make sure that the project is compliant with the access and parking design standards. But since we are still kind of finessing the plan, it's not currently meeting the standards, but we will get to a point that it is.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay. And then let me just see what else I have here. Oh, could we go back to the Saltapuedes street frontage, please? I'm really confused about the landscaping and what's happening there. There's a landscape concept plan in our packet, but it doesn't show the sidewalk. So I'm trying to understand. So will we have a, and I can't read these dimensions on the screen here, but staff is recommending a 5-foot wide sidewalk and a 4-foot 6-inch wide planter, I guess on the building side of the development. So it would be curb, sidewalk, planters. Is that correct from what staff is recommending?
Thank you, Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Wiscombe. So what would be recommended from Transportation Public Works would be the 6-inch curb, the 5-foot sidewalk. And we recommended the elimination of the parkway, which would traditionally have a tree well or landscape planter area. And so the 5'6" or the 5-foot sidewalk, or excuse me, space beyond the sidewalk that you're seeing, that would be identified as the remaining frontage zone. So landscaping would be supportable in that area if that's what the applicant's proposing. Typically, it's just a buffer space between the existing development and a sidewalk to give some relief.
So how wide is what's left over?
Commissioner Wiscombe, I believe it would be approximately 4.5 feet. And you are correct that the landscape plan in your packet does not match the latest site plan. It hasn't been updated to include that sidewalk.
Oh, okay, thank you for that. So we do have an opportunity to add some landscaping that would be along the building frontage, right? Or along the building edge there. Okay. And then what I'm also concerned about is you've got well, what are those utilities there on the
next to the existing? Are they existing utility boxes or? Yeah, so Chair Schwartz, Commissioner Wiscombe, those boxes are the existing HVAC condensers. So Public Works staff was supportive of the sidewalk jogging in areas where there's some existing pinch points. The HVAC condensers would be one of those areas. And then also there's one existing parking space that would be in that same sort of plane as the HVAC condensers. We were supportive of that. Also jogging in the sidewalk to comply with the existing development.
Okay, so where the transformer's going, the proposed transformer, would that be another jog in the sidewalk there? Is that conceptually?
Sidewalk there would need to meet the 5-foot requirement, so it would need to be set back from the back of the 5-foot sidewalk. So that would likely change where the transformer sits.
Okay, and so there's probably, based on what the applicant said, there's about the space around the transformer in order to work around it, there's probably little opportunity for any sort of significant screening with green screening around it. Would you agree with that? based on what's been said here today?
Yes, if it was kept in that proposed location, it probably wouldn't
Okay.
have much room for
Yeah.
landscape screening in front of it.
Okay, great. And I think that pretty much covers almost everything. My last question is, there was, and we received some letters about parking in the neighborhood, et cetera. So would transportation staff recommend a parking demand study be done on this project? That was one of the comments in our staff report, that it might be appropriate to do a parking demand study.
Yes, thank you, Chair Schwartz and Commissioner Wiscombe. We would recommend a parking demand study be done for the requested parking modification. And at that time, we can determine if the proposed development would meet the demand.
Okay, that's great. Okay, I think that's the end of my questions. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Which of my colleagues would like to go next with questions of staff and the applicant team? Commissioner Bonderson, follow-on question.
Sure. In lieu of the silence, I'll jump right in. Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually have a question. I just have to, I think I need to direct it first to Mr. Busk, perhaps. I'm curious to know about open yard ordinance. Hello, there you are. I was curious to know in our municipal code, how or whether private open yards space can compensate for the requirement or the lack of the requirement of the shared common open space. How does that work?
Thank you, Chair Schwartz and Commissioner Bonderson. Technically, the answer is no. There is no method of providing open yard where private can compensate for the common. However, it's often one of the rationale used to support an open yard modification. You know, sometimes the shared space or the at-grade space just is not feasible on a particular site. And so we have certainly approved modifications where having additional or excessive private open space is seen as a reason to support the open yard modification.
Okay. And I noticed in this proposal that, particularly in the staff report, it's laid out on page 9 of 52. It's under C, open yard modification, about halfway down. You wrote it, so you should know. You do talk about certain units that have ample open space in comparison to others that do not. And I was curious to know, when they do not even meet the private required open space, how is that handled at the city level? Are we now asking for mods for that as well, or do we just, how does that work?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. It is a little bit confusing because we have not only our standard open yard requirement, but we also have this alternative open yard option that applicants can take. Under the alternative open yard option, they do not have to provide any private open space. And so I believe the applicant was, originally pursuing that option, which is why the private open space does not all comply with the minimum standards. If they were to apply using that other standard open yard requirement, then the modification would also address the fact that 2 of these units do not have the minimum private open yard.
So just to reiterate, make sure I understand, offering this alternative private yard open space doesn't completely wipe out the requirement for the common open space. It's just something we put forth to consider to give leniency. Is that how it is?
Commissioner Bonderson, that's correct. It's an additional way to meet, to find compliance. There are certain findings that the Planning Commission would have to make, essentially that it's providing equivalent amenities in terms of open yard.
And would that then come to us as a different offering for a mod, like they're requesting a mod, but for something different than how it's laid out here? Is that how that would come back to us if they decide to do it that way?
Commissioner Bonderson, it would still be an open yard modification. They are also requesting the waiver of the 10-foot minimum dimensions. So that would be a part of the modification, is considering that waiver of the dimension.
The dimension of the private space.
The dimension actually of the on-grade common.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. I appreciate the explanation and the double check. And that actually takes me to the next question that will be directed to the applicant, if I can have them come back on. Hello, Ms. Turner. Thank you for being here today. I am interested to talk about this this topic of the private open space, and I wanted to know. It's probably very obvious, but was there a specific reason other than just lack of space that some of the units don't meet the private space, open space goal?
Thank you, Chair Schwartz and Commissioner Bonderson. I'll do my best to try to clarify. I think we'll start with staff on this slide and then move up, and then I'll let Mark chime in as well. The area that we're discussing that doesn't meet the 10 by 10 is caused by the existing development, the way the building is sit with a 6-foot interior setback. So if the staff person with their cursor can show the L-shaped area to the, what is the west, along the western property and the northern property, that area is where we're requesting some relief. So no, it'd be going up higher, like a reverse L, where it says proposed site plan, right below that.
Screen.
Let's go differently. Can we go to slide number 35, where we have the exhibit for the open yard waiver modification with the purple, yellow, and green areas? That might be easier to. Getting closer.
While we wait, can I just ask, the units that do not have the private space, they're on the existing portion of the structure? Or are they on the proposed?
No, they are not. So I'm going to walk you through it. On the upper right corner is the, yes, right there. In yellow shown, kind of in a reverse L shape. Those are the areas around the existing building and to the northern property line and western property line where we need some relief, because the minimum dimension is 6 feet by 200 and some feet long, or 6 by 100 feet long. And then the open courtyard that's existing within the existing building would contribute to the 15%. The diagram below is the second floor, where we have provided common open space that exceeds the minimum of 20 by 20, just for reference, of 596 square feet. We were including that in our open yard originally, and combining those 3 areas I've just described, we were nearly at 13% of the 15% net lot open yard area. Staff just recently, as recent as yesterday, has indicated to us that the common roof deck area that we provided in the residential zone cannot contribute to the 15%, and therefore would not be part of the adequate areas. That kind of refers back to her memo, Allison's memo. Following again here on this floor plan, the purple areas, light and dark purple areas, indicate all of the private open space that we provided for each unit. And if you look through the floor plans to the left, most units have 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 sets of private open space. So from our perspective, what we were trying to identify is that we are a constrained site and we need just a little extra help to get to the 15%, knowing that we provided more than adequate private open spaces that really give it a nice quality, enjoyable space for each tenant, especially given now with our COVID standards, perhaps that these private open spaces will have even more use perhaps than the common open spaces, whether it be on grade or on the roof deck. I'll pass it on to Mark. Thanks, Mark.
I'll just add one thing. I think what Allison is referring to is that the two of the units, if you look at the lower right-hand diagram, the two, with the small purple decks in front, the top one, which would be the westerly one, and the southerly one that's next to the common area open deck, those two have the small cantilevered balconies in front of them. The one that's the unit that's in the middle is a one-bedroom unit. So if you go up the diagram in the upper left-hand corner, it also has another deck in the middle right there. That meets the requirements for the private open in terms of the dimension. We could, when we come back, we could take on the lower level of the condominiums, the two units that are currently now, the balconies are too small. We could look at the possibility of expanding those out to meet the minimum size as well, so that all of the units would have at least the minimum square footage for the outdoor space. And in this case, all of the rest of the units would have, even more than minimum, because they'd have multiple decks and they would have multiple decks with the required dimensions as well. So that would be something we could do to help alleviate this issue.
Mr. Kirkhart, I'm so pleased to hear you suggest that. That's where I was going, as you could probably guess.
Yeah.
I think that it would really show good faith that you are trying to reduce some of the things that we're making exceptions or asking for exceptions on. And I do think that time in our community, we don't want to reduce private outdoor space if there is some form of design solution that we could, apply. Very pleased to hear that, and I look forward to that being part of your next round. Thank you so much. I got the answer I needed on that. And then I was also curious with regard to the on-grade open space. We've heard a few different comments about if you were to meet that requirement at that location, that you would ultimately need to lose a unit to be able to do so. I'm interested to know what other areas on this site you have explored, even if you didn't bring it here today and you looked at it and you've moved on. What were some of the other areas that you may have looked at to try and accomplish the open yard area?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Bonnerson, the first one was that we really, when we first embarked on this project, is we thought we had an additional 30 feet to the north of us between our property and the medical office building that's to the north of us. As you saw when you went to the site meeting, or if you're out there later, there currently is a picnic table, and people that live in this project, the two people that live upstairs and the people that work there are using that as part of their open space. Unfortunately, we don't own that. It was a unusual, something happened through the title company or something, that 30-foot space actually ended up still in the ownership of Cottage Hospital. And it's a 30-foot wide by the width of the property, completely unusable for anything else. And our ownership has made a tremendous effort to try to purchase that pretty much useless piece from Cottage Hospital. And unfortunately, that's fallen on deaf ears. We're not able to come to any kind of a conclusion. That was one, and that we thought that was, that we kind of thought we had that going in, to tell you the truth. Other than that, area on the ground, as I mentioned earlier, on terra firma, the only way to get that would be to start removing parking spaces from the lower parking lot. And that would be putting open space, even though we might, let's say we do a parking demand study, which I'm confident will come out because we've done a lot of projects like this with shared use, that parking demand study would work in our favor. We may be able to eliminate a few parking spaces down in that lower parking lot to add some additional square footage. It would just be landscaping. It would not be, obviously, you're not going to put a table and chairs out in the middle of the parking lot, but perhaps we could do something like that by eliminating some, if the demand study suggests that we could lose a few parking spaces, we could convert a few of those open parking spaces on the lower lot into more landscaping to get us closer to the open space. It would have to be a minimum of the 10 by 10 or 10 foot. So we could certainly investigate that before we come back, depending on the outcome of the parking study, the demand study.
I really appreciate you, Mr. Kirkhart. You're thinking my on the same track as me. I'm really interested in having you and your team propose some other options, or at least explore them before we decide that they're off the table, and really see what can be done to reduce the number of modifications or the extent of those modifications. And so I'd really like to see that just as you've proposed here. My very last question, and again, we've heard a little bit of discussion about parking and how you already have a minimum parking. We're requesting even less parking. And I'm curious to know, since we are going underground for the lift, the proposed lift, have you or can you look further into maybe completing the floor down there to get all your parking spots under that structure? Has that been looked at? Is there a reason it may or may not be an applicable option?
I think now we're pretty much maximized in terms of the parking on that upper level. Melissa, you could probably confirm that in working with the consultants we worked with. So I think we had earlier schemes where we had full underground parking that proved to be not at all economical. So we're pretty much kind of pushing up against what we can economically afford to do at this point. I think the outcome of the parking demand study is what we should really hang our hat on, because I have a feeling that will work in our favor.
I don't know if Ms. Turner wanted to add anything, but that answered my question. It's a feasibility.
It does.
Yeah, isn't it always?
Yeah.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it always, yeah.
Back. Thank you, Madam Chair. That concludes my questions. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. Commissioner Lodge, would you like to go next with questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Wiscombe's and Commissioner Bonderson's questions have answered some of my questions. I was disappointed to hear that while the applicant tried to buy the property, the leftover property from the St. Francis project, they weren't able to, because that would certainly solve a lot of problems. I still have a question about the parking. On the site visit, I noted that there were assigned spaces on the upper level parking lot. Are those, and this is for the applicant, are those for the offices in the existing building?
Commissioner Lodge, Chair Schwartz, yes, to answer your question, the lower level parking lot is favored for patients visiting those medical offices, and the upper lot is reserved for the tenants and I guess employees of the medical offices, mostly to prioritize patients to be able to have quicker access to the building.
So if this project goes ahead and that parking goes away, I still don't understand how the existing building is going to meet its parking needs.
The new proposed project will be offsetting any losses of on-grade parking that is on the upper lot. So the new parking structure will serve the 7 condos, new condos, and the balance of the commercial parking of the existing building.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I guess those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lodge.
Ms. Turner and Mr. Kirkhart, before we go to Vice Chair Escobedo, I'm wondering, just to make it perfectly clear to everybody, and you discussed this with us a bit on the site visit, but for those commissioners who couldn't make the site visit, this separation or distinction between which automobile owners will be able to use which areas of the parking system. Could you just review that and clarify that? I think that could be helpful for us all.
Sure, Madam Chair. So the plan, as we're proposing it, would have all of the patient parking on the lower parking level. There are no lifts proposed on that level at all. And so in the upper garage would be the parking requirements to meet the housing, as well as the people that are working in the commercial condominiums. So those people would park in the upper parking lot and be able to utilize you can see we've got an elevator in there with a accessible access. So they would be able to take the elevator down and walk across and get over to the existing medical building. So that's the way it's divided in our proposal. Currently, I believe that Ms. Lodge's question was, she had noted that the upper lot had all shown assigned parking for the various businesses. That, of course, with this proposal will change. They will still get assigned spaces up there, but they would not be as they are currently now on the surface lot. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. I think that may be helpful for Vice Chair Escobedo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are for Mr. Busk, actually. And apologies, I need some insight because I don't work in this field, so this might be an elementary question, but it should be helpful for the public as well. So I'm looking at the setback requirements for the first and second stories and compared to the third and fourth stories. Can you give me some insight into what is the purpose or the spirit behind having the 10-foot setbacks at the first and second stories versus the 20-foot setbacks at the third and fourth?
Yes, Chair Schwartz and Commissioner Escobedo. The purpose of that is to avoid having a very tall building facade so close to the street. So it requires a little bit more relief, more step back for that third story, which will reduce its visibility, generally reduce impacts on any views, etc. We did used to have a more complicated formula for the third story setback. It was a percentage, and now it's just a straight number to make it a little bit easier to implement.
And so for that particular modification, the front setback modification, I was taking a look at the findings. It's reasonable to view it as, in this case in particular, that third story unit that we were discussing earlier, that Mr. Campanella and also Commissioner Higgins were discussing, that the decision is essentially between the visual or the impact that it has for a pedestrian or someone who's in the neighborhood versus having that 2-bedroom condo unit, right? Because if we deny the modification, it essentially wipes out most of that unit. Am I viewing this correctly? Is that or a better way to put it, is that a reasonable way to view this?
Vice Chair Escobedo, I would recommend taking a step back in terms of how you're looking at it, just because there are different ways to organize the units and distribute them within the site. So I wouldn't be able to say that necessarily you couldn't provide the same number of units and the same size without that setback modification, if that makes sense. There may be other places that the floor area could be expanded to compensate that's not in the setback. So I think it's one way to look at it, but the critical thing is, can you make the findings in support of it?
And is it staff, it appears that way anyways, is it staff's opinion that there is that ability and flexibility to rework the location and size of units so that you get something similar while meeting the setback, or at least a more reasonable, get closer to that setback requirement?
Commissioner Escobedo, I think that there is a potential. Now, naturally, that's a simplistic view, and it doesn't take into account how the stairways work and the parking and how it's all related. But that's where we really want the applicant to show us what other options have they looked at. Is there a way to comply? And if there is, why are they choosing a different option?
And to this point, have they done that?
Vice Chair Escobedo, no.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I really appreciate you walking me through that. And Madam Chair, that is my only set of questions.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair Escobedo. Let's see, who do we have? Commissioner Reed and maybe myself. Commissioner Reed, any questions for staff and the applicant in this concept review before us today?
I have no additional questions, Chair Schwartz.
Okay, thank you very much. Any follow-on questions before I go to mine, Commissioner Bonderson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Please excuse me for popping back and forth. Something else came up, and I wanted to be very clear. I'm not sure if I missed it in our package, but perhaps the applicant can help. I am interested in learning if there has been any interest or discussion on the idea of solar energy being added to this project, whether it's to serve the building itself or just as storage. Has that been on the table whatsoever?
I'll answer. Yeah, yes, it's absolutely on the table. We will be including it in the final design.
Okay, that's it. So we'll be looking forward to that as well. Thank you.
Okay.
Madam Chair, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. Very good. I'll ask my few questions now before we take a 10-minute break, which we usually do about 2 hours into our hearing. Mr. Busk, if I could ask you to please first come on, and my questions are not in any particular order. Let's go to the AUD ordinance and what I was revisiting the ordinance and what I'm trying to be clearer about, and this is under additional development incentives. I don't believe that Mr. Hamilton will have this in front of you, so I'll just reference this. So this is 28.20.070 additional development incentives, particularly market rate ownership projects within the SD2 overlay zone. This pertains to parking. I'm trying to understand, or maybe you could explain how staff is looking to reconcile the parking requirements for our condominium development, and that ordinance predates the AUD's 2013 enactment. So I don't know if you and Ms. Ostringer need to sort of coordinate a comment or reply. What kind of determination will you make, and what is the basis for which regulation or which ordinance is most appropriate to apply?
Chair Schwartz, thank you. That is a very good question. As you point out, the AUD ordinance does have this one specific comment that talks about ownership units in the Upper State Street overlay zone. And so it implies that ownership units outside of that zone do not require the extra parking. However, we also have Chapter 27.13, which specifically references Chapter 30.175 for the required parking. So those are in conflict, as you say. And in terms of rectifying it, our intent and hope is that that gets fixed and cleaned up with these AUD ordinances that are going through the process right now. We do think that those will get through the process before this project is ready for a decision. But as you say, in terms of if this project came in first and we had to make a decision right now as to which code section was the more applicable, we would need to talk with the city attorney and make that determination as to which is more specific.
Maybe it's a historical application assumption where a policy or ordinance that's enacted at some point subsequent to a prior, that the more recent would be the one applied to a project that comes in. I don't know if it needs to be more explicitly reconciled than that. Could you or Ms. Ostringer comment, and then I'll move to my next question.
Yes, Chair Schwartz, the one difficulty with that is that Title 30 was adopted around the same time that that ordinance was enacted, that the AUD ordinance was enacted. So it's not quite so clear cut that one came after the other, because we did amend chapter 27.13 to specifically reference Title 30, and it specifically referenced the more restrictive parking standard. What we don't know is if that was intentional or if it was just an oversight.
Okay. Well, before I go to my next question, can't help but comment here. This highlights the critical nature of the detailed work that staff and the Planning Commission do, and that does fall to us specifically when we either create new ordinances, new policies, or amend. We really have to look at this granular detail because it plays out in real life development or redevelopment. Okay, let me come back now to our packet. I want to ask you not to go back too far in time, but when the Villa Riviera project was coming through the city, and that was a few years before I started serving on Planning Commission, I'm just curious, big picture, how the findings were made, or the basis of the decision, create this new Salsa Puedes portion of the street and narrow the street to a substandard width. So how is that approval achieved?
Chair Schwartz, unfortunately, I do not have the extensive history as to how that came to be, why they chose the dimensions that they chose. You can also see, based on our site visit, based on the aerials, that the sidewalk dimensions on the Bella Riviera site, most of it does meet our standard 6 foot, but some does narrow. You also see that the parkways exist in some locations and not in others as a way to make it work. My estimation is that a lot of that was based on the fact that this was an affordable housing project. It was 70% affordable units. And so I believe that was the reason why they could approve certain modifications and why they may have gone with a narrower street width.
Okay, just seems like it was really kind of shoehorned in to approval with a lot of exceptions, and again, predates me, so I was not aware of all the considerations. Then I want to ask you about a statement on page 5 of 22. This is in the staff report, and I don't want to bother Mr. Hamilton necessarily pull it up. It says, although zoning modifications are a tool for certain zoning criteria to be modified, they're typically not supported for new construction, where there is opportunity to build a conforming project. Needing multiple modifications for new construction is often an indication that the proposal is attempting to overbuild the site, and it goes on from there. I'm wondering, this is a pretty strong statement, and so I was wondering if staff had time to do any research in terms of data points around in support of this statement, or was just a general recollection?
Chair Schwartz, it's not necessarily based on data points, because many of the modifications that we see as potentials, when they find out the staff recommendation, they don't all proceed. So the majority of the modifications that the city reviews do go to the staff hearing officer. And one of the first questions that she asks is, did you explore any conforming options? Why don't those conforming options work? And so from a staff perspective, that's also where we start, is why doesn't a conforming option work? There is a reason we have zoning standards. There's also a reason why we have this modification option, is because sometimes those standards create an unnecessary burden. And we do understand that there are constraints on this site. A corner lot is often viewed as a constraint. The existing development can be viewed as a constraint. So there certainly may be rationale to support modifications, but in general, that is staff's starting position, is that new development should comply. And if it doesn't, you need to really explain why it doesn't.
Okay. My next question is regarding the sidewalk plan. And I don't know if this is to Ms. Momolsky. Maybe we could also pull up whichever slide or view is appropriate to look at the proposed plan. And we had a number of public commenters speak to us about this today, how they view contiguous sidewalk to be very important. I'm wondering from your transportation planning expertise, Ms. Momolsky, if we have any pedestrian safety data, you know, accident data, etc., that would send us in a direction of making some comments, again, not a decision today, regarding considerations of contiguous versus non-contiguous. I mean, I can sort of think of what seems common sense to me, but this is your area of expertise.
Thank you, Chair Schwartz. I don't know that I have specific data on pedestrian incidents or safety hazards. I could look into that and see if we do have any information. What I will share is that, sorry, I'm just looking for it in this section here of staff report. As part of the pedestrian master plan, there are different attributes to good sidewalk corridors, such as accessibility or adequate travel width, safety, continuity, landscaping, social space, and quality of place. Since we've compromised on other attributes like landscaping, which would be the parkway area, we've done that to ensure adequate travel width and accessibility and safety are established. So again, when you have, you know, it should be wide enough to accommodate several people walking at one time. That's the hope. So I could look into whether or not we have specific data on any kind of pedestrian incidents, but I would have to get back to you on that. I don't have that on here.
That's all right. You know, I'm thinking back to a number of hearings, very, very different kinds of hearings. A planning commission where engineer, I guess he's senior engineer, Derek Bailey, has spoken to us about whether it's pedestrian expectation, driver expectation. And the reason I'm asking this is I'm recalling that this concept, or even maybe the practical issue of, in this case, pedestrian expectation, what happens when you start a sidewalk and there's pedestrian and nearby automobile expectation that there will be protection of pedestrians if they remain on a sidewalk, but then all of a sudden the sidewalk breaks, and for whatever reason. And I just think that we have an opportunity here to significantly improve pedestrian safety and the connectivity or potential conflicts between pedestrians on this very steep portion of Salsa Puedes with auto drivers. And so that's why I asked that. Maybe that's just something you could note, again, because today's concept. Let's see, and then I have a question about the renderings. Maybe this is to Mr. Busk or possibly the applicant. We were shown some very helpful, in my opinion, helpful renderings today, these perspectives of the proposed project on the street and within the immediate neighborhood.
Madam Chair, we cannot hear you.
Thank you. I was trying to mute my background. I have my air conditioner on. I apologize. Okay, back to the ABR minutes versus these very helpful renderings that Mr. Kirkard showed, where we could see the proposed projects within context. And when I went to the ABR meeting minutes, and let me tell you, I think this is from the May 20th ABR hearing, on page 50 of 52 in our packet. Numbers 1 and 2 in the motion mention, this is continuing, etc. Applicant shall return with three-dimensional views of the project, preferably in the form of a model that can be viewed on screen, provide bird's eye aerial photographs surrounding neighborhood, and provide additional photographs of the buildings immediately adjacent to the project. So just to confirm for me, if you would, that was May 20th, and here we are, September. Can I assume then that ABR has not seen these renderings that you've shown us today? Is that correct?
Chair Schwartz, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I missed a part of what you said.
So on the one hand, today we've been afforded these renderings that you and Mr. Kirkhart provided, sort of the infill proposed renderings to give us perspective, contextual perspective. When I go back and read the ABR meeting minutes from the May 20th meeting, you were there, they mentioned in their motion that they had not yet seen three-dimensional views of the project, that you will return with those. So can I just assume then that they have not seen these renderings that we've been afforded today? Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay, because I'm assuming that's going to be very helpful for them.
I think we may have had some early on 3D masking, but it was not done in context with the aerial maps.
Okay.
That's why I hesitated to answer correctly.
Okay, thank you so much. My last question is to Mr. Busk before we go to a 10-minute break. And Mr. Busk, I think it was this is a follow-on to a question that Commissioner Wiscombe asked, and this is the very last page of our packet, 52 of 52, pertaining to the March 9th ABR meeting minutes. I'm just wondering, in terms of the modifications being requested and hearing Mr. Kirkhart's identification of some neighboring projects that over the decades seem to have received significant modification approvals. Has staff made the ABR aware of these key neighboring project modification approvals in order to sort of have a broader perspective of what the city has allowed over time, and perhaps even the rationalizations for that? I was asking you about Bella Riviera, for example.
Chair Schwartz, no, staff did not provide that. And I do believe that it was only Bella Riviera that received modifications, because the other buildings, again, were developed assuming an interior setback. So it was different than what the current requirement would be. But ABR, it was able, they are aware of the context, so they were able to see how those existing buildings are developed.
Okay, Ms. Turner, did you want to comment to my question as well?
Yes, Chair Schwartz, I wanted to comment on something somewhat relevant to your last question. We had a project, a 4-unit AUD project, a little west of us on 501 East Mitchell Torino, where an open yard waiver was granted for areas that were less than 10 feet. So not related to a front setback modification or street setback modification like the Bella Riviera did, but open yard. I just wanted to throw that in since it was somewhat relevant.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Okay, those are my questions. To my colleagues, anyone else have questions before we go to a 10-minute break? Okay, I see it as a 3:05. Let's come back at 3:15. Thanks, everyone. We're in recess. And in coming back, I'm going to ask my colleagues to come online. We're going to go into our comment period now. And again, just to remind everyone, today we have a voluntary concept review for 533 East Mitchell Terrena Street. And so it is comments only, no decision will be made today. And just for reference, on page 14 of 52 in our packet, we have findings. And staff would like us to reference those findings in our comments. We have a tentative map, subdivision ordinance consistency, general plan consistency, and so on. So with that, who would like to go first with comments? Anyone eager to do that? Commissioner Higgins, you didn't have many questions. Would you like to go first with comments? Not to put you on the spot, but to move this along. Commissioner Higgins, I think you're still muted.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, would you like to go first since you didn't have many questions, just to kick it off?
Well, if that's a protocol, Commissioner Reed should go first, but I'll go. Good discussion. I kind of like concept reviews, and I don't like them. Taking a page out of another commissioner's, former commissioner, rhetoric. I'll probably say something I regret tomorrow, but so I'll just say that it looks like there's probably some more work to do to generate exhibits or better stories about why these are all needed. And just because they exist elsewhere usually isn't the right bar to hit. I mean, I know that's all relevant in terms of compatibility, but if that was the standard, then we wouldn't really even have a need for modifications to begin with. So it looks like a great infill project. Obviously, what for me matters a lot on these things is how ABR looks at it. So I'd be looking for additional comments on some of those question marks that were brought up by other commissioners too about the ABR proceedings. But it's going to look great no matter how many square feet it has or how many units. No doubt the architect and the team are and it sounds like the developer are committed to something that's going to fit in nicely and be another outstanding architectural contribution to the neighborhood.
Thank you, Commissioner Higgins. And I'm wondering if it would be helpful, Ms. DeBusk, to put up on the screen that excellent slide that you provided of process, just so everybody's clear about sort of the life cycle of this effort, in case there are more questions or just commentary about where the project is now, where it goes next, and so on, back to Planning Commission. Could we find that slide from your presentation? There we go, slide 20. Thank you. Very good. Commissioner Higgins?
Yeah, just sorry. I think it would be fun to see a dashed line on this, a point in time at which the AUD codes are changed to reduce parking. So you could see, oh, well, right in between concept and PLN is when the parking changes, right? So that's one that comes off the list. That's the assumption.
Okay. Commissioner Reed, did you throw your hand up there for a moment? Did I see you wanting to go next?
Yeah, I just don't want to be a hypocrite, Chair Schwartz, since I asked the fewest questions. So I'll throw myself in.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, so I agree with Commissioner Higgins. This is a sound project architecturally. It's beautiful style. It's beautifully designed. In general, I would encourage more of an attempt to reduce the number of modifications. I know staff has taken that position. I made may not take as strong a position, but nonetheless, I would encourage a reduction, an attempt in reducing the number of modifications. And assuming the applicant can reduce those, I think they can, but still have some requested. I'd like to see more specific, very specific information to support the required findings we have to make. I think there's room to build at least a more conforming project than what's being presented today. So I suggest showing more conforming options. And I don't disagree with staff's position when they state that a disapproval of modifications, maybe not all of them, would not preclude a reasonable use of the property. This is a income generating property as it stands today. It's already developed with commercial and residential uses. As far as the constraints presented, it being a corner lot, the slope, existing development, I don't see those overwhelmingly preventing new development on the site from largely conforming to zoning requirements, at least moving closer to conformance compared to what we're reviewing now. To get more specific on front setbacks, I'm just not really seeing the physical constraint or justification for the encroachment, especially when you consider that the average unit sizes for this project's maxed out. I would say any parking within the front setback should meet the design standards, period. As far as interior setbacks, the applicant had explained that this was done to create architectural interest, and that's valid. I just don't see the full justification necessary to make the required findings. As far as open yard, I thought the public comment about effectively the open yard use or the lack of open yard on the property kind of spilling over onto adjacent properties, utilizing their open space, that's valid. This project's not meeting all the standards. And when you look at, let me pull it back up here. When you look at the alternative open yard design standards and findings, that was in our memo, not our staff report. I have particularly difficult time with 5B, approval of the alternative open yard design that will meet the purpose of the required open yard as described in this section. So I would go back and look at that. Parking modifications, this is complicated with the ordinance confusion. It needs to be cleared up. I'm not sure at this moment I'm ready to take a position on it aligning with the AUD requirements. I will say this site has commercial parking that's already non-conforming, and it's underparked under the current parking requirements, 36 compared to the 40 required based on the 10,000 foot medical office use. So yeah, I'd like to see where everything goes with the city multi-unit housing standard update. If pressed by staff to make more specific comments on that, I'm happy to do that. Parking design needs to meet the parking area design and development standards. It just has to. And then I think lastly, proposed sidewalk width. From my perspective, my position right now, I do not support the narrower proposed sidewalk by the applicant. I support a 5 foot sidewalk, and I'd be okay with it jogging in a little bit, but in general, a 5 foot sidewalk the whole length would be great. That should do it.
Thank you, Commissioner Reed. Who would like to go next with comments? Commissioner Wiscombe?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with a lot of Commissioner Reed's comments and also Commissioner Higgins. I really feel that more work needs to be done. I like the architecture I like the fact that this is an infill project. I think that's a tremendous benefit. These are just the types of projects that we need. But I do think that the number of modifications and the type of modifications that the applicant is asking for are too great and too extensive at this point in time. And let me just go into some details. I'm particularly guided by ABR's last motion made at their meeting on March 9th of 2020, the last time they saw this project. Number one, the applicant shall comply with the 20-foot setback requirement for the third and fourth floor. Any significant modification requests for this setback would be problematic and not acceptable. They are asking for an encroachment of 11 feet 6 inches to reduce the width down to 8 feet 6 inches. And I feel this is significant, and I agree with ABR on that. They also talk about the transformer, and that's this is on page 52 of 52 in our packet. The transformer location needs to be significantly altered and screened in a more permanent way. I understood the applicants having been through the process, and this is a good location for the transformer, but after I heard about the amount of space you need around it to work, I'm very concerned with the fact that they won't be able to screen it. And I think that needs further work for the front setback. So those are kind of where I am on front setbacks. The interior setback modification from 10 on stories 3 to 4, from 10 feet to 8 feet 6 inches for architectural interests. I am concerned what the staff report says when they say that modification lacks justification necessary to make the findings required. So I think that needs another look. Let's see here. Regarding the open yard modification, I was pleased with Commissioner Bonderson's questioning of Mr. Kirkhart that units 4 and 7 maybe will get another look to bring their private open yard up to the standards, and they wouldn't be deficient any longer. I think that merits some attention. And I really feel that there simply isn't enough common open yard space on the site, and although there might be a modification, I think further attempts must be made by the applicant to identify some additional areas of potential common open yard in order to support even if they come back with a modification. So we know that they've made a good faith effort, and there's not quite the deficit that there is now. With respect to the parking modification, I was pleased with Mr. Kirkhart saying that a parking demand study will probably operate in his favor. I'm very much in favor of that. And obviously we need to meet our parking area design and development standards, which apparently the project doesn't meet right now. So that will need to be updated, but I think the parking demand study is important. And I am concerned about taking the legal non-conforming 36 spaces when 40 were required down to 34 spaces. So I'm hoping that's part of the parking demand study. Commissioner Reed brought that up too. Let's see here. The sidewalk width, I support staff recommendation, and Commissioner Reed had the same comment, 5-foot width with the planter next to the building. And, you know, if it needs to pare down in some spots, that's something that we could certainly look at. And do I have anything else here? Yeah, and I do think that we need to need to have a melding between the condominium ordinance of two parking spaces per unit versus the AUD of one parking space per unit. And that just adds confusion, and I'm hoping that gets resolved in a wider way before this comes back to Planning Commission. In other words, one or the other changes, so we know exactly what we're dealing with. But again, I think the parking demand study will help guide that process. And I think that's all I have for now. Did I cover everything? I think I did.
Yes,
So,
I think so.
thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Wiscombe. Commissioner Lodge, comments?
Commissioner Wiscombe went through it all so thoroughly. I'm not going to repeat what she said. I agree with everything that she said. Commissioner Reed and Commissioner Higgins also said. This is a piece of property that the applicant knew what the constraints were when they started work on this project. And I just think too much development is trying to be squeezed into it with way too many modifications. So I can't support it in its present form. I couldn't make the findings. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to go next? Commissioner Bonderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to go through my list. I think that there will be many common points, but just to make sure I don't miss anything, I'm just going to go right through it. I want to start by saying design-wise, just looking at the design, not thinking about ordinances and municipal codes. I really like looking at this project. It's pleasant, it's welcoming. I love all the little intricacies. However, since we do have to look at the site and we have to follow our code, I'm in agreement that it just feels too tight, setback to setback. And it's really unfortunate because to be able to meet the expectations and to reduce all the number of modifications, we do need to consider having the applicant scale back the project, really look at mass, bulk, and scale, and do their best not to be requesting as many modifications as we see here today. I'm also in agreement that ABR's comments should be followed and really have an effort made, which I believe Mr. Kirkhart has expressed multiple times with the different questions that were asked, that there is more exploration to be done. And so I'm really looking forward to having the applicant come back with a updated project for us to review in the future, and before that to hopefully have ABR's comments met. So moving forward, I wanted to say with regard to common open space, common open yard space, I can't see the justification for the modification at all for that at this time, although in the future, if they do manage to present something that's a little bit closer, I'm sure a modification request could be made, but not today. I would like to have them find creative ways to resize the units, potentially reduce that request for the setback modification, and meet the open space requirements to the best of their abilities before we see the project come back. Again, Mr. Kirkhart did mention that, so I'm really, really pleased to hear that he's going to be looking at giving the minimum private open space, that balcony, consideration for units 4 and 7, and make sure that all the units have adequate private space, as well as the open yard space in whatever configuration might have to be made, even if they have to give up a parking spot. With regard to parking spots, however, I agree with my fellow commissioners when they said that the parking requirement, the area standard has to be met, at least get a lot closer than it is now. Sidewalks, I would also like to agree with Commissioner Reed when it comes to the sidewalk comment. I'm concerned about having it modified to 4 feet. It needs to meet the community requirement for pedestrians. And the topic of solar design came up. It wasn't here today, but I understand they're working on it and we will see it in the future. I think that's really, really important. So please make sure that that is part of the project as it comes back around. I also would like to know more if and when maybe it doesn't need to come back to PC, but for staff to make it clear what type of neighborhood modification approvals have been done in the past in order to make sure that there is precedent, or if there isn't even a need for that. I mean, each project is individual, timing is individual. And so I think it's really important that one project doesn't lead the other project. The site is unique. So I'm really interested in knowing more about that, since it was such a heavy comment made today over and over again. Lastly, I think that it's really important just to make a friendly reminder to our applicant and to the owner that if there is any type of legal concern with the other property owners, with stakeholders of this property, based on Mr. Lynch's public comment, that needs to be handled early on, and there needs to be some type of consensus otherwise this project won't be moving forward, regardless of how lovely it is. So hopefully everyone will be working together and we will be seeing a modified project coming back to us. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I missed anything, but I think I covered most of it. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Bonderson. Vice Chair Escobedo, comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as everyone has highlighted, the design is great. It fits right in with the surrounding buildings and the neighborhood. I differ somewhat with my fellow commissioners in regard to the front yard setbacks. What I took away from my exchange with Mr. Busk is those setbacks exist to address mass, bulk, and scale. And so I find it interesting that in one comment, the ABR was supportive of the mass, bulk, and scale, and then in the next comment spoke about not being able to support the front yard setback. And so I say that not saying that there shouldn't be more work in regards to that setback, because the setback requirement is 20 feet and they're asking for quite a bit of a setback exception. So I would like to see the applicant work on that a bit and reduce that setback, but I don't think that it has to meet the full 20-foot requirement. And the reason being is I'm always skeptical when I see nice round numbers. So 10 feet for first and second story, 20 feet for third and fourth story. And so I always go to what's the intention and what's the spirit of having requirements like those. What are we trying to accomplish? And so I would like the applicant to work on that, to getting closer to addressing the concerns of ABR. I could be supportive of the modification in the future, especially if, as Commissioner Higgins and many others have highlighted, I think it's reasonable to tell us why that is the preferred option. What other designs have you looked at, and why did you not go with those? Why is this the one that is the best, and why you need the modification? And I don't think that story was told on many of these modification requests. So that's what I would highlight. That's what I'm going to be looking for in the next, when this comes back to Planning Commission. In regards to some of the other modifications, I would like this, as Commissioner Wiscombe brought up, I am supportive of a parking demand study, and the parking demand study is going to inform a couple of things. It's also going to inform the location of the transformer. As we noted, an alternative is reducing 1 to 2 parking spaces. If the parking demand study comes back and it says that they can accommodate losing those 1 to 2 spaces and meet the demand, it could be that we are able to screen better and provide some better alternatives, meet the parking demand, meet the concerns of ABR, and not have to provide that modification. So I'm really looking for more information there from that study. the sidewalk 5 foot, I didn't hear any real justification for decreasing the size of that. Obviously, there's going to be undulations where it's going to fall under that 5 feet, but where possible, I'm fully in support of the 5 foot sidewalk width. And then open yard, again, I just haven't seen or heard much from the applicant on their attempts of trying to get closer to that common open yard requirement. I would like to see attempts to get closer before I would support a modification. And if possible, in a dream world, continue working to work with Cottage and see if that's possible to meet the requirement. But I think that is it, and I addressed everything, Madam Chair, but if not, feel free to prompt me.
Thank you, Vice Chair Escobedo. Any other comments, follow-on comments from my colleagues before I go to my comments? No? Okay. Because this is concept review and it's not a more detailed review for approval, I want to make some general comments first. I've been hearing in the community there's a great demand for condo ownership, home ownership. And here we are with the first one under the AUD program. So my encouraging kind of overarching message is let's make this happen in the best way possible, balancing the expertise, technical expertise of ABR with our policies, our regulations, safety considerations, all of that in order to achieve the greatest number of condominium units that we can with supportive parking. And here we also have the lift system, the parking lift system, which is a new factor, a new technological invention since many of our ordinances were enacted years ago. So I think that we have a golden opportunity to provide condo ownership with some of the provisions afforded under the AUD program, using this technologically advanced parking apparatus, while also making sure that everything from pedestrian safety, including ingress, egress studies from the parking study, and Ms. Momolsky and our transportation staff looking at that carefully. Appropriate open yard, but let me also say that we have so many wonderful neighborhood parks, and especially, during the pandemic, starting to come out of the pandemic, hopefully, I see more of our community members using parks individually or with their dogs, their families, and so forth. And I'm hoping that we continue that kind of community use of our communal open space, our public open space. And I think that's bringing community together much more than trying to shoehorn in a lot of open space, parcel by parcel. We're a 90% built out city. Would we all love more open space in our own, wherever we are living? Sure. But I think we need, as planning commissioners representing the whole community, I'm hoping we can also step back and say, what's the greatest use for not only a particular parcel, commercial, residential, but also the community? How do we help through our decisions build sustainable community? And I think the pandemic has really highlighted what community building can be, even more than it was prior to the pandemic. Now, in terms of particulars, my colleagues have commented on so much detail. I don't want to go back over that. But it is interesting to me that in ABR's 2020 meeting minutes, they seem to be very clear in their 9 points as to where they had lingering concerns and wanted to work with the applicant further, and where some aspects of the project are acceptable. So the comment I want to make about that is that I think consistency is very important in our decision-making bodies. If we have come to a particular position, this is ABR or Planning Commission, and we've expressed the basis for that, the justification for that, applicants rely on that in continuing to make an investment in moving a project forward. So I'm just hoping that as staff works with the applicant and applicant with ABR, that there are some consistent guideposts that can be applied such that this can move through the process we see on the screen as efficiently as possible, massage the project, get it to where it needs to be within the site constraints so that it can come back to the Planning Commission at whatever date is feasible and where there's a majority of the commissioners who feel very comfortable supporting it in its form at the time. I only wish, speaking of Commissioner Higgins dreaming, one of my dreams would be that a less constrained parcel could be identified in our city for an AUD condominium project. And so I'm going to kind of throw this over to Mr. Kirkhart. Talk to your clients, talk to property owners, to see if you can find another parcel that isn't so constrained, because we certainly could use more condominium ownership projects. I know that I'm asked fairly regularly, when are new condos going to come online close to downtown? So many people want to move away from whether it's the hills or what we might call our more suburban areas of town, want to come closer to downtown, but they also want home ownership and equity opportunities. So with that, I don't think I have anything more to add since my colleagues have really covered everything. I'm going to come back to my colleagues. Any other final remarks maybe that we didn't touch on by way of concept comments? Okay, Ms. DeBusk, did we leave anything out that's important for staff and taking this back and working with the applicant and ABR?
Chair Schwartz, I think you have covered everything. However, since it's a concept review, it might be worthwhile to ask the applicant if they're clear on the direction or if there's any lingering gray areas.
Okay, very good. Ms. Turner, Mr. Kirkhart, if you would like to rejoin us and let us know, was this helpful in terms of guidance for you?
Yes, that's very, very helpful. We need to go back to the drawing board, talk to our client, and come back before the board with a revised project. I think it's safe to assume that it's going to be one less unit. We have done a lot of studies on this over this time, so that's just want to lay that out there. But thank you for your time today. It's been very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkhart and Ms. Turner and Ms. Gray. Okay, with that, I think that we have concluded this item. Let's go to our final work today, and that's our administrative agenda. And it's committee and liaison report time. A staff hearing officer, do we have a liaison report, Commissioner Higgins?
Yes, Madam Chair, yesterday, 3 items, all of which were several combined interior and front yard modification requests, ironically, or not, but nothing out of the ordinary.
Okay, indeed, ironic, that's for sure. Any other committee and liaison reports? And I'm thinking, Commissioner Bonderson, not to put you on the spot, but you chatted with me about something, so I'm going to see if you would like to give us an update on one of your recent new roles.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I assume you are referring to the State Street Committee? Yes. We have not had another meeting, but it is tentatively scheduled for Wednesday, September 22nd from 4 to 6 p.m. That is not set in stone. And I was just trying to check in to see if they might have already set the next appointment for a meeting, and I don't see that they have. So that's still pending, with the expectation of September 22nd from 4 to 6. So please stay tuned. I was going to just share an ABR topic, and I wanted to make sure that it has already been posted. If it has not, I'm not going to talk about it yet. Let me just double check something. No, so I have nothing to share. We are all up to date and caught up. There hasn't been any meeting for the Transportation and Circulation Committee recently either.
Commissioner Bonderson, question for you back to the State Street Master Plan Advisory Group. Could you let us know now if there's a page on the city website that we can go to for this new committee and maybe sign up as an interested party to start receiving the information?
Yes, there is, which is what I was just looking at to see if I could give you an update. It is, let's see. The page itself is, well, that's not true. They have two pages. One is more of an overview page. The other one is an active page, which has not yet been active, made active. But I don't want to give you the wrong information and then you don't find it. But it is called the State Street Advisory Committee. There is a website. It has not yet, let me see. I apologize. I had it open, but it's not something that is easy for me to share here. They do have, I may just want to reach out to Allison, excuse me, Ms. DeBusk, excuse me, and see if you could provide a active page at this moment. I only have the agenda in front of me.
Okay. I think it's important. The public is also interested. I've received a few calls myself about the meeting schedule, you know, what has transpired, the meeting schedule. And so I'm certainly hoping that there is an active page where any interested parties can sign up. And because this is a Brown Act working group committee, the public needs to be afforded that information in order to view or follow it. Mr. Busk, do you have, I don't know if you're in a position to just answer the question before we go to any other, is that it? State Street Advisory Committee, it's right in front of us now.
That was it, yes.
Did you find it? Oh, that's the same page
Yeah,
I have. This is the page. It's not the one
That's the main page, and if you click on the agendas link off to the left, there you go, and that will give all the current staff reports and information.
Mr. Busk, I thank you because I had that page open and I had already opened the agenda, and that second page I couldn't figure it out. So, Chair Schwartz, does that help you and the public how to find it? What you're looking for is to just
Yes,
search.
I think that's, yes. I think the public's going to be very interested in following this. So thank you very much. And thank you for serving on that committee.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And it's been interesting thus far, even though it's been just one meeting and some organization behind the scenes. I do want to just mention, as I said a moment ago, the date is still pending. It is expected to be Wednesday, September 22nd. It does not show here on the screen that you see on this in front of you, but that's what we're working towards. So if anyone is interested, stay tuned for that date coming up.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Any other committee liaison reports? Going once, going twice. Okay, I think that concludes our business today. Thanks, everyone. It's 3:55, and our meeting is adjourned. Please stay safe and stay well. See you all.